Little girl spoke Korean too, the wounded mafia boss. They are beating my mama. His response shocked the city. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Rain. Yi-Won Shin was a man the city of Seoul feared the way it feared an earthquake. Not because his arrival was loud or theatrical, but because when he entered a room, everything went silent, the air itself seeming to tighten, to reconsider. As the supreme commander of the Chengryong Syndicate, the Blue Dragon organization, he had built his dominion one brutal, ruthless negotiation at a time across nearly 2 decades. His name was spoken in hushed tones in police precincts, in corporate boardrooms, and in the back alleys where Seoul's forgotten underworld quietly moved its invisible gears. He was 41 years old, and he had not known a single night of genuine peace in almost 20 years. On this particular evening, he was bleeding. A rival faction, young, reckless, dangerously desperate, had made the catastrophic mistake of ambushing his convoy in the rain-soaked industrial district near Mapo. The attack had been poorly planned and worse executed, and his men had neutralized the threat in under 4 brutal minutes, but not before a knife found the soft space beneath Yi-Won's left ribs. It was not a fatal wound. He had survived far worse. But it was deep enough to matter, deep enough to slow him, and in his world, slowing down was the first stage of dying. He had ordered his driver away. He needed to think, and he could not think surrounded by the clatter of panicking men offering him loyalty wrapped in incompetence. He needed silence. He pressed his hand against his side and walked slowly, methodically, the way a man walks when he is conserving everything, through the narrow backstreets of Mapogu, the rain falling in gray sheets against the amber glow of convenience store signs and street lamps. He had wealth that could purchase entire city blocks. He had men who would throw themselves into traffic at a single nod of his head. He had power that bent the will of politicians and prosecutors alike. And tonight, bleeding in an alley in the rain, he had no one to call. Not a single person in the world who would hear his voice and feel something other than fear or obligation. That was the truth Yi-Won carried beneath all the armor, beneath all the reputation, a profound, aching, years-long loneliness that no amount of empire building had ever been able to fill. He turned a corner and stopped walking. He leaned against the cold brick wall of a narrow residential lane in Mapogu, one of those ordinary, overlooked neighborhoods where Seoul's working families quietly built their lives, and closed his eyes against the rain. Image prompt Chapter 1. Cinematic wide shot, a tall Korean man in his early 40s wearing a dark, expensive suit standing alone in a rain-soaked alley at night. His left hand presses against his ribs beneath his jacket. His expression is stoic, exhausted, and deeply solitary. Background: neon convenience store signs, rain-slicked cobblestones, blurred amber light. High contrast, moody noir atmosphere, photorealistic, 8K resolution. Chapter 2. The sound that stopped him. He heard the voices before he saw anything. At first, they blended into the ambient noise of the rain, low, aggressive, threatening. The kind of voices Yi-Won had heard 1,000 times in his life. The voices of men who had decided, for whatever reason, that the power of a clenched fist was the only language worth speaking. Then he heard the other sound. Higher, younger. A child crying not with the aimless grief of a nightmare or a scraped knee, but with the terrified, gulping desperation of a child who was watching something terrible happen to someone they loved. Yi-Won's body moved before his mind made any conscious decision. Pain or no pain, bleeding or not bleeding, his legs carried him around the corner with the swift, silent economy of a man trained by a lifetime of dangerous motion. What he found in the narrow lane stopped him cold. 3 men, mid-20s, cheap leather jackets, the particular cruelty of people who believed no one was watching, had a woman backed against a wall. She was slender, somewhere in her early 30s, wearing a food service uniform that told its own quiet story of long shifts and small wages. Her name, though Yi-Won did not know it yet, was Nia Osai, a Ghanaian-Korean woman who had lived in this neighborhood for 4 years, who worked double shifts at the restaurant 2 streets away, who had built a careful and honest life on the foundation of sheer, unbreakable determination. The men wanted the small bag she carried. Nothing dramatic, nothing political, just the ordinary, gutting ugliness of 3 bored young men deciding that a woman alone in the rain was a reasonable target. And at the edge of the scene, pressed against the opposite wall with her tiny hands clenched at her sides, was a little girl. She was perhaps 6 years old, wearing a yellow raincoat with a small duck stitched on the breast pocket. Her face was streaming, rain and tears making no distinction between themselves, and her eyes were locked on her mother with an expression of pure, helpless anguish that was the most devastating thing Yi-won had witnessed in a career defined by devastation. Then the girl did something that stopped the entire universe. She looked directly at him, this enormous, bleeding, rain-soaked stranger in the expensive suit, and she spoke. Not in English, not in her mother's Twi, in Korean. In small, careful, desperate Korean, the kind learned phonetically by a child who had grown up hearing a language all around her. Ajasi, she said, the Korean word for a respected older man, for an uncle, for the nearest available adult. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Jebel, apaga iamarul ti terigo isioyo, please, they are beating my mama. Image prompt chapter 2. A young girl approximately 6 years old, African features, wearing a yellow raincoat with a duck patch, standing in a rain-soaked alley at night. Her face is turned upward, expression desperate and tearful. In the blurred background, the silhouette of a woman against a wall and looming male figures. Cinematic, high contrast, rain-drenched, deeply emotional composition. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. Yi-won Shin had not been moved to instinctive action by another human being in longer than he could remember. His world was one of calculation, every step measured, every consequence mapped, every emotion subordinated to strategy. But those 5 words in broken Korean, delivered by a child who had learned them the way children learn words that matter by desperate necessity, reached through every layer of armor he had spent 2 decades constructing and did something precise and irreversible. They reached the part of him that was still human. He stepped into the lane. He did not announce himself. He did not raise his voice. He simply appeared massive, rain-soaked, bleeding, between the 3 men and the woman. The quality of his silence was different from ordinary silence. It was the silence of a man who had stood in far more dangerous places than this and never once looked away. The 3 young men felt it immediately. The bravado that had seemed so natural 30 seconds ago now felt like a costume they were suddenly desperate to take off. Yi-won looked at each of them in turn. He said nothing. He did not need to. In his eyes was the complete, unambiguous biography of a man who had built an empire in the places where other men would not go. The message was not a threat. It was simply information. There is no version of what you are considering that ends well for you. The men left, quickly. The lane was empty within seconds, their retreating footsteps dissolving into the rain. Yi-won turned to face the woman. Nia had pressed herself against the wall during the confrontation, shielding herself, her breathing coming in ragged, frightened waves. But she was watching him now with dark, searching eyes, not yet grateful, not yet trusting, but deeply attentive. She was a woman who had learned to read situations fast. Before either adult could speak, the small figure in the yellow raincoat crossed the lane at a dead run and threw both arms around her mother's waist. Nia sank immediately, kneeling in the wet street without a thought for her uniform, gathering her daughter against her chest with the fierce, helpless tenderness of a mother who has just understood how frightened she was. Sina, I'm okay, she murmured into her daughter's hair in English and Twi both. Mom is okay. Yi-won stood in the rain and watched this reunion, and felt something shift in the architecture of his chest. Image prompt chapter 3. A tall, imposing Korean man in a dark suit standing with his back to the camera between a frightened woman against a wall and 3 young men backing away. Rain falling heavily. Powerful cinematic composition. The woman's eyes are visible over his shoulder wide, searching, beginning to lose their terror. Dramatic low lighting, film noir aesthetic, photorealistic. Chapter 4. Shelter. It was Sina who noticed the blood first. The child, who had been pressing her face against her mother's shoulder, suddenly leaned back and looked at Yi-won with enormous dark eyes and pointed one small finger at the growing dark stain on the left side of his jacket. "Ajasi," she said again, in that careful Korean, her expression shifting from residual terror to the immediate, uncomplicated concern that is one of the most purely human things in the world. "Pyaga na yo, you're bleeding." Nia stood up sharply, her own composure snapping back into place with remarkable speed. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and saw what she had not had the luxury of seeing during the confrontation. The wound, the pallor beneath his stoic expression, the way he was holding himself just slightly off-center, compensating for pain with the practiced discipline of someone who had done it many times before. "You need to come inside," she said. Her voice was calm and certain, not a suggestion, not a timid offering. A declaration from a woman who, whatever she thought of him, whatever warning instincts were firing beneath her composure, had already made up her mind. "I do not want to impose," Yi-won said. The words felt foreign in his mouth. He could not remember the last time he had said them to anyone. "You just saved my life," Nia replied simply. "Come inside." Her apartment was 3 floors up in a narrow building that smelled of cooking spices and old wood, the smell of a home that was deeply, unmistakably lived in. It was small and meticulously clean, with a child's drawings covering the kitchen wall and a second-hand sofa draped in a bright patterned fabric that somehow made the whole room feel warm. It was the kind of home that money could not exactly replicate, because it was built from intention rather than budget. Yi-won, who lived in a penthouse designed by award-winning architects, stood in the middle of it and felt, inexplicably, that he had been missing something for a very long time. Sina pulled out a small chair at the kitchen table and looked at him with great authority. "Angio," she instructed. "Sit down." He sat. Image prompt Chapter 4. A cozy, small apartment kitchen at night. A young girl in a yellow raincoat at a kitchen table, gesturing authoritatively at a chair. An imposing Korean man in a rain-soaked dark suit obediently sitting at the small table, looking utterly out of place but completely compliant. Warm, incandescent light, colorful children's drawings on the wall, intimate and slightly humorous composition. Chapter 5. The table between two worlds. Nia cleaned and dressed his wound with the quiet efficiency of someone who was accustomed to solving problems with whatever was available. A first aid kit, clean cloth, steady hands. She worked without flinching and without asking the question Yi-won could see forming in her eyes, the obvious, unanswerable question of who he was and how a knife wound had come to live in his ribs. She didn't ask. He did not offer. And somehow that mutual unspoken agreement created a space between them that felt, paradoxically, more honest than any conversation he could remember. Sina, meanwhile, had decided that the large and slightly terrifying man sitting at her kitchen table was now her project. She brought him a glass of water with tremendous ceremony. She placed a small, slightly battered stuffed animal, a brown bear with a missing button eye, on the table in front of him, with the solemnity of someone offering a gift of real value. She explained in a mixture of English, Twi phrases, and the small constellation of Korean words she had assembled over her 6 years of living in Seoul, that the bear's name was Kofi, that he was brave, and that he would help the Ajasi feel better. Have you ever had a child offer you a beloved stuffed animal when you were wounded in body and soul, and felt the specific gravity of what that costs them? Yi-won had not. He held Kofi in his enormous, scarred hands with more care than he had handled anything in years. Nia set down a bowl of soup in front of him without ceremony. Jollof rice soup, warm and fragrant with ginger and tomato, and sat across from him with her own bowl, and Sina climbed into her chair and began eating with the focused determination of a child who is now satisfied that the crisis has been correctly managed. She taught herself Korean from the children at her school and the television, Nia said quietly, not looking up from her bowl. A small smile moved at the corner of her mouth. She decided it was important to speak the language of the place we live. She is considerably more committed to it than I am. Yi-won looked at the child. Sina was stirring her soup and singing something under her breath, entirely unbothered by the fact that the most feared man in Seoul's underworld was sitting across from her. She is remarkable, he said. And then, because the word felt insufficient, I have never met anyone quite like her. Most people haven't, Nia said softly. Image prompt Chapter 5. An intimate kitchen table scene. A tired but warm African woman in a food service uniform sitting across from a large, formidable Korean man in a damaged suit. Between them, steaming bowls of soup. A young girl eating happily, a one-eyed stuffed bear sitting beside the man's bowl. Warm, golden kitchen light, children's drawings in the background. Hyper-realistic, deeply emotional, two worlds meeting at a shared meal. Chapter 6. What walls are made of. The rain continued outside. Sina eventually fell asleep on the sofa, curled around Kofi the bear, her yellow raincoat still half on in the way that only exhausted children can manage. Nia draped a blanket over her and returned to the table, and the two adults sat in the quiet of a sleeping child and a city washed clean by rain. You don't have to tell me who you are, Nia said. She wrapped both hands around her tea mug. But I think you know that I can see the shape of it. Yi-won was quiet for a long moment. Outside, rain tapped against the window in its rhythmic, indifferent cadence. I have been many things, he said finally. Very few of them are things I would describe to a woman who deserves honesty. Nia nodded. I came to this country with Sina's father 7 years ago. He left 4 years ago. It was easier to disappear than to stay and become the man she needed. She said it without bitterness, the way you describe whether simply what happened. I stayed. I learned Korean. I found work. I built what we have here. She glanced at the small, warm room. It's not much. It's everything, Yi-won said. He was not being polite. He looked around the kitchen, the drawings, the mismatched cups, the well-worn furniture arranged with obvious care, and he meant it with a completeness that surprised him. I have a great deal of everything. Buildings and accounts and men who obey me. I have never had what is in this room. Nia studied him for a moment. What is it in this room that you don't have? He did not answer immediately. He looked at the sleeping child. He looked at the bear on the table. He looked at the drawings on the wall, crayon suns with human faces, a family of 3 rendered in brilliant yellow and orange. A house with smoke rising cheerfully from its chimney in the way that children draw houses when they feel safe. Evidence, he said at last, that I was ever here. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms around a truth that has just been spoken out loud for the first time and needs a moment to fully become real. Nia set down her mug. You could be different, she said, not as a challenge, simply as information. The way his eyes had delivered information to those 3 men in the alley. People decide to be different every day. It's not as rare as people who are afraid of change want you to believe. Image prompt Chapter 6. 2 adults sitting across from each other at a small kitchen table late at night, tea mugs between them, a sleeping child visible in soft focus on a sofa in the background. The woman has a quiet, steady expression of wisdom and compassion. The man's expression is open, vulnerable, stripped of its usual armor. Rain-streaked window, warm, contemplative lighting, cinematic portrait composition. Chapter 7. The morning he did not expect. He had not intended to stay until morning. He had not intended any of it, the alley, the child's voice, the soup, the truth-telling at a kitchen table in Mapogu. But somewhere between the rain and the quietness, he had fallen asleep in the chair, his head bowed over his folded arms like a penitent, or like a man who had, for the first time in an extraordinarily long time, felt safe enough to stop watching. He woke to the sound of small feet on a linoleum floor and opened his eyes to find Sina standing approximately 12 centimeters from his face, regarding him with the absolute fearlessness of a child who has already decided this person is safe and is now simply studying a fascinating specimen. "Jalgasio," she asked, "did you sleep well?" "Ni," he said, and found that it was true. Nia was in the kitchen already, moving with the quick efficiency of a woman who had a school drop-off and a double shift ahead of her, and precisely no margin for delay. She had changed out of her uniform into clean clothes, and in the early morning light, Yi-won saw something he had not fully taken in the previous night: the quiet, unassailable dignity of a woman who had built her own life from nothing, and was entirely unimpressed by the fact that it wasn't more. She handed him a cup of coffee without ceremony, and did not comment on the fact that he had spent the night in her kitchen. He drank the coffee. It was good, simple and hot and good. As Nia helped Sina into her school bag, the child turned around and walked back to the table. She reached up and very carefully retied the lace on Kofi the bear, who had apparently spent the night standing guard beside Yi-won's coffee mug, and then looked up at the man with absolute seriousness. "Ajasi," she said, "will you come back?" The question was so direct and so uncomplicated, and so devoid of any agenda beyond its own sincere wondering that Yi-won felt it land somewhere in the center of him, with the weight of a far larger thing. He held her gaze. He thought about his empire and his men and his accounts, and the long, cold rooms of his penthouse overlooking the Han River. He thought about what Nia had said: people decide to be different every day. "Yes," he told her, "I will come back." He said it the way men in his world said things when they meant them completely, not as a promise that could be adjusted, but as a fact about the future. Image prompt Chapter 7. Early morning light in a small apartment kitchen. A little girl in a school uniform, African features, standing on tiptoe to place a one-eyed stuffed bear beside a large man's coffee mug. The man is watching the child with an expression of profound, overwhelmed tenderness. A woman in the background, backlit, ready for work. Soft dawn light, warm and hopeful atmosphere, cinematic composition. Chapter 8. What the city saw. What happened in the weeks that followed was the thing that shocked Seoul, or at least, the particular circles of Seoul that paid attention to the movements of Yi-won Shin. It did not happen all at once. Great changes rarely do. They accumulate in small, undramatic acts, like rain collecting in low places gradually, then undeniably. He came back to Mapogu. He did not arrive with an entourage or with the theatrical apparatus of his usual world. He arrived the way any person arrives at the home of people they respect, with something useful in his hands and the decency to knock. He helped Sina with the Korean reading exercises her teacher had sent home. He sat at the small kitchen table while Nia told him about her week at work, and he listened with the full, focused attention he had previously reserved only for intelligence briefings and high-stakes negotiation. He learned that she wanted, eventually, to open her own restaurant. He did not offer to fund it. He asked her what kind of food she would serve and listened to her answer and did not try to solve it. That restraint, that choice to simply be present rather than to use resources as a substitute for presence, was the first genuinely difficult thing he had done in years. He began making other changes, quietly, methodically, in the way he did everything. He began extracting himself from the Syndicate's most brutal operations, not in a single dramatic declaration, but gradually, transferring responsibilities, creating distance, beginning the long and complicated process of a man trying to step back from the edge of the cliff he had been standing on for 20 years without falling off in the process. His lieutenants noticed. His rivals noticed. The city's underworld, which watched these things with extraordinary attention, noticed. The story that circulated, whispered in the back rooms of restaurants and the corridors of precincts, and the offices of prosecutors who had spent years building cases against him, was that Yi Won-shin had been softened, that a woman and a child in Mapogu had done what investigators and rival factions and the full weight of accumulated consequence had failed to do. They said it as though it were a weakness. They were wrong about what it was. It was not weakness. It was the hardest, most deliberate, most costly thing a man of his history could possibly attempt. It was the decision to want something other than what he had always wanted, and to pursue it with the same absolute commitment he had previously aimed only at dominion. Sina drew a picture of him. It was in the same crayon style as the family of three on the kitchen wall, rendered in confident, joyful strokes. A tall figure in a dark coat standing beside a smaller figure in a yellow raincoat, both of them holding hands beneath a large round sun with a smiling face. She gave it to him on a Tuesday afternoon, holding it up with the ceremonial gravity of someone presenting a formal document of significant importance. Yi Won held it with both hands and looked at it for a very long time. He thought about the man who had bled in an alley 3 weeks ago, the cold, exhausted, invulnerable ghost walking through rain with nowhere to go and no one to call. He thought about all the things he had accumulated and all the things those things had cost him. He thought about 5 words in careful, phonetically learned Korean spoken by a 6-year-old in a yellow raincoat. Ajasi. Jebel. They are beating my mama. The 5 words that had, without any intention or strategy or plan, reached through 20 years of deliberate armor and reminded him that underneath all of it, he was still a man who was capable of being moved. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the breast pocket of his jacket, directly over his heart. If you have ever had a single unexpected moment, a child's voice, a stranger's kindness, a cup of coffee at a kitchen table in the rain, change the direction of your life, then you understand what Yi Won-shin understood standing in a small apartment in Mapogu on a Tuesday afternoon, that we do not always get to choose the moments that transform us. Sometimes, grace simply arrives in a yellow raincoat and speaks to us in the 5 most important words we will ever hear. We have only to answer. He looked up from the drawing. Sina was watching him with her hands clasped behind her back, awaiting his verdict with the patience of someone who already knows the answer. "It is perfect," he said. She nodded. She had known it would be. Image prompt Chapter 8. A tall Korean man in a dark coat kneeling to be at eye level with a young girl in a yellow raincoat inside a warm, colorful small apartment. He's holding a child's crayon drawing with both hands, his expression completely open and moved. The little girl is watching him with a proud, satisfied smile. A woman stands in the